when you think of hydrogen and you want to drill, baby, drill. Problem is, you got to refine, baby, refine. And the refinery does not work unless you have hydrogen introduced into a catalytic cracker to break pot and oil into all the different elements. And same goes with chemical plants. It's a catalyst, and it goes into all of these processes. And it is, in and of itself, regardless of how it was produced, but in and of itself, zero carbon. So the introduction of something like hydrogen into those processes actually lowers the carbon footprint of what we've been using for years.
Welcome to Smarter Markets, a weekly podcast featuring the icons and entrepreneurs of technology, commodities, and finance, ranting on the inadequacies of our systems and riffing on ideas for how to solve them. Together, we examine the questions: are we facing a crisis of information or a crisis of trust? And will building smarter markets be the antidote? This episode is brought to you in part by Abax Exchange, bringing better price discovery and risk management tools to navigate today's commodities markets through centrally cleared, physically deliverable futures contracts in energy, environmental, battery materials, and precious metals markets. Smarter markets are here.
Welcome back to Weathering Decarbonization on Smarter Markets. I'm Dave Greely, Chief Economist at Abax Technologies. Our guest today is Mike Prokop, Executive Consultant at the Clean Hydrogen Buyers Alliance. We'll be discussing the challenges and the progress that's been made building U.S. Gulf Coast hydrogen and ammonia markets, and what comes next. Hello, Mike. Welcome back to Smarter Markets.
Well, hello, David, and thank you for having me back.
Well, I was so glad that I ran into you at CERAWeek and we were able to talk about this. And I'm even happier that you were able to join us on the podcast, because on this podcast series, we've been talking about the challenges and progress that's been made down the road to decarbonization. And I think that the path that hydrogen has been on is a great example of both the challenges and the progress. So really glad to have you here with us.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me again.
And hydrogen's received a lot of attention over the last few years for its ability to help decarbonize hard-to-abate sectors like heavy industry. But the path to adoption has not been an easy one. So I was hoping we could start off by maybe going back to the beginning. What got you involved in this market? In short, why hydrogen, and why hydrogen in Houston?
Well, Houston, probably by far in the United States, is the largest user of hydrogen. So if you really want to use the Wayback Machine, as I like to say, we can bring hydrogen all the way back to 1520, probably about 28 years after Columbus hit the West Indies. So that's when hydrogen was discovered as an individual element in the EU and in Europe. So its various forms and uses and for power and lighting and all transportation and everything over the years have brought us to this point. And there are two things that really got us going on this. One, of course, was the Department of Energy with its hydrogen hub concept and the 8 different regional production facilities, if you will, production hubs for hydrogen across the United States. A bold plan, well-funded. And I sit here in probably one of the more progressive areas, and that is here in the Houston area along the Gulf Coast of the United States. The other would be California, two of the bigger ones. And the reason being is the industrial base, but also the user base. So California had already a lot of different initiatives around transportation. One of our partners here at the Clean Hydrogen Buyers Alliance is the Hydrogen Fuel Cell Partnership, run out of Sacramento by Bill Elrick, a fantastic guy. And they already had in upwards of 38,000 cars, hydrogen-powered cars on the road with fueling stations, something we don't have here in Texas. So what do we have here in Texas and Louisiana and surrounding Gulf Coast areas? We got a whole lot of chemical plants and refineries. And when it comes down to it, when you think of hydrogen and you want to drill, baby, drill, problem is you got to refine, baby, refine. And the refinery does not work unless you have hydrogen introduced into a catalytic cracker to break pot and oil into all the different elements. And same goes with chemical plants. It's a catalyst, and it goes into all of these processes. And it is, in and of itself, regardless of how it was produced, but in and of itself, zero carbon. So the introduction of something like hydrogen into those processes actually lowers the carbon footprint of what we've been using for years.
And that's fascinating in that you've got some of the large existing industry, as you mentioned, in the Gulf Coast area, refiners, petrochemicals using hydrogen. And then you've got it in the very futuristic hydrogen fuel cell use in California. When you think about building a hub in the Houston area, who do you see as the big buyers? And maybe who are the big buyers in your organization, the Clean Hydrogen Buyers Alliance?
So we're careful not to give away our membership without their express permission. So I'm sure you can understand. But what we do have, think of the major refiners. Okay. So these have been the people that have been with us since the beginning of things. And I can even dial back the Wayback Machine, not to 1520, but more to about 2023. And give some background on that. But also, chemical refiners, think of the large chemical plants in this area and all along the Gulf Coast, because it truly is a Gulf Coast thing. It's not just Houston. And again, another one of our partners is the Gulf Coast Catalyst, Brett Perlman. Many of you know was a former commissioner in the Texas PUC and very involved with the Greater Houston Partnership. He was CEO there of their hydrogen endeavors, which helped bring us in as well. But what makes it very, very attractive here in this area is we have the immediate need, we have the demand, we have the production facilities. It's already been being produced, whether it's through hydrolysis or steam methane reformation. But we also have another need, and that is we continue in this area, as some other areas of the United States have, to try to lower our carbon footprint. So we have hydrogen buses coming online at the major airports. We are talking a lot about transportation, even a civilian transportation in the area. And you have a lot of the IGCs, as we're referred to, the industrial gas companies, such as, and there's three really, which is Air Liquide, Linde, and Air Products. So those three are dominant in the marketplace, but there are others coming on. That's what's really sparking a whole lot of interest and excitement in this market right now, is the fact that we are seeing independent producers, very aggressive independent producers. A lot of this could be maybe dialed into the outlook for data centers and other needs for power generation, power storage, things like that, where hydrogen is already playing a part in that.
And at the Clean Hydrogen Buyers Alliance, you've advocated and advocate for a hydrogen benchmark. Why is this so important, and how would that help the hydrogen market develop?
Well, your previous question you asked very early on was what really interests me about this. And I think, David, you and I go back a little ways, and you know a little bit about my background. I've always been in the markets, even as a young little college grad back in 1985. So, yeah, this is my 41st year doing this and kind of been around the block a few times. And whether it's in institutional brokerage, global derivatives brokerage, moving on to exchange management as the energy asset class leader globally for the CME Group and other great endeavors. And then I also went on to end up being a managing director at Deloitte, where in the energy resources program there, and dealing a lot with our sustainability folks. So when hydrogen started, if you will, to me being a thing, when we started hearing about the DOE's interest in what have you, I got pretty excited about it. And we brought up this organization. And while it does talk about the Buyers Alliance, we named it that because there was a lot of focus on the, if you will, the creation of the hydrogen, so the sellers in the market. Okay. So who was really representing the buyers? Well, lo and behold, we did retain the name, but we are open to sellers, buyers, marketers, even consultants. We have transportation people. Think of major car makers that are producing hydrogen powered vehicles right now in trucks. Think of pipeline companies. We have people laying last mile pipeline, very important. Comes off major, maybe natural gas pipelines into a plant to produce hydrogen, things like that. So it's a little market microcosm, if you will, where like minds come together with a single goal, and that is to improve this market, reduce carbon in the environment, very importantly, and also be able to, you know what, we might make a little bit of money on this as an industry. And one of the ways that you could possibly do that is to bring a trading environment to this market, which it doesn't have right now. So there's been, when we talked about the NASB contract in the past that we helped put together, a 15-month endeavor that actually came out. I'm very, very proud of all the progress we made. John Flory here at the Alliance Risk Group and also Chiba was instrumental in doing that. Keith Sappenfields from Cheniere was hugely important in this. We didn't stop there. So we do have through NASB, the North American Energy Standards Board. It's been around since 1991. We now have a group put together focusing on ammonia. Okay. So as traders, as brokers, what do we love to do? Sure, we can trade a single commodity, but we also love, for perfect hedge, what do we do about a spread? So if we want to buy one and sell another, what do we do? So hydrogen and ammonia go hand in hand. You need hydrogen to produce ammonia. And I like to think too that we're doing a good for Mother Earth, and that basically we now have hydrogen as a mainstay in the energy markets, and we have ammonia as a massive part of the food part of our existence here on this planet. So energy and food covered by hydrogen because we have ammonia that makes fertilizer, hydrogen that makes energy products keep the lights on and people healthy. That's the direction we're going. So we are now working on a standard contract for ammonia, and it will have similar attributes as the hydrogen contract, which will both have energy attribute certificates, which basically, much like think of it as a REC in power, it will be directly dialed into the production and the sale of the hydrogen. And it also can be bundled or unbundled into every transaction, so it can be transferable as well. So that gets a lot of people excited about this and why we had to start opening up the membership to Chiba.
And for people who may not be as familiar with how a market develops and how it's built, when you first came to the hydrogen market, what was the state of how hydrogen was bought and sold? Was it long-term contracts? Was it internalized within companies? What did you find when you first started looking at it?
So check both of those boxes that you just mentioned. So very much long-term contracts. We're looking probably 10, maybe in some cases 20-year contracts. And major industrial producers, which given economics, the global footprint of hydrogen, the smaller producers just weren't available yet, right? So, but yet the economic and the industrial machine of the United States and all the major countries around the world that are using this commodity continue grinding on, and they needed more and more and more hydrogen. So with that, it did open the door to the opportunity to go ahead and find people that were forward looking enough that saw hydrogen as an opportunity to invest in, to create smaller plants in some cases, geographically less fortunate locations for transportation, delivery, and use. But you could put smaller plants up where there was an abundance of, say, natural gas and maybe some transportation to move the hydrogen in and out of. The market started coming together. And as we know, most of the markets that trade in the energy scope start with a good, robust physical market. And that was what we were finding here in hydrogen. It was a little bit consolidated, but again, along with the timing of what the DOE did to actually create credits to produce hydrogen for new entities, then it just went hand in hand. And we saw the opportunity that, you know what, maybe this is something that we can start really lowering carbon footprints with. We can make people compliant with scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions reporting and create something like an EAC where it's known, it's documented, and potentially transferred between parties to facilitate these transactions. So that's when the excitement really got going.
And you mentioned recently the North American Energy Standards Board, NASB, kind of put forward the first ever North American hydrogen contract. So kind of a standardized contract instead of probably the bespoke contracts that had characterized things before. One interesting aspect, they replaced the color codes, right? Anybody who's been in hydrogens, there's been like green, blue, gray, pink, based on where it was sourced from and how it was produced. Replace those color codes with carbon intensity, which sounds like a a more standardized metric that people can operate on. Can you walk us through, though, the development of that model contract and why that is important to developing the market as a whole?
Sure, absolutely. And forgive me, anytime during this, I do my happy dance because, boy, this is another thing that opened the market up. I mean, thank you for bringing it up. Yeah. So, again, the concept of green, blue, everything in between. We had gold, we had pink, we had magenta, we had all sorts of colors, depending on basically what the production process was that created the hydrogen in the first place. And we all get that. What we were able to do is there was a model that was out there that was backed by the government called the GREET model. It was difficult to deal with. It was even something that we would get feedback that was so big on internal, basically computers at companies, it would crash computers. It really had to churn a lot of stuff. Again, this is a fantastic market for innovation. Other things came along. One of the folks, I'll just use these folks as an example that be working with some time, is the Open Hydrogen Initiative. They are part of GTI Energy. So OHI is a nonprofit, and they took the GREET model and went to a instance and environment of now focusing on carbon intensity. And what does that allow us to do? So instead of having, if you will, walls that we have to stay in between for green, blue, gray, whatever, we now have a spectrum literally of how much carbon does the hydrogen have that is being bought and sold. And remember, we said that hydrogen is basically a carbon-free element. But again, this takes into account a number of things, and this makes everyone happy that's really trying to get dialed in on their scope 1, 2, 3 reporting. It takes into, okay, how it was created, how it was transported, how it was even stored in some cases here. Tank could have been on a number of different things. Type of pipeline that it was used to transport. Was it shipped? All of these things affect the carbon intensity in ways that there may be carbon that is produced because of all that process. There may be carbon used to, again, move it. And all of those things go into that model. And what it does too, and rightly so, the EAC, I mentioned, that energy attribute certificate, has a carbon intensity product to it. So again, now you're dealing with a certificate, if you will, that actually has very, very closely dialed in numbers and identification of what it is and its value in the marketplace.
And certainly carbon intensity had to be one of the big areas to get agreement on how to measure it and how to include it in the specifications for the model contract. Were there other aspects of the specifications that required some work to get people to agree on? I imagine everybody kind of likes the contract written their way, but you need to get some standardization to build a market. I was just curious if there were challenges on any certain elements there, or had the physical market already come to a consensus?
So there was at the beginning. And so what did we do? We're pretty proud of this. We figured out, when I say we, and especially folks like Keith Sappenfield's been doing this for literally 50 years and worked on the original natural gas contract when it was Gisby through what is now NASB. All of the hard stuff, and not to put lawyers out of work, we certainly don't never do that, but the stuff lawyers get involved with, force majeure, compensation for non-delivery or whatever it might be, is all standardized, okay, in the contract. And that's the stuff that delays transactions weeks, months, maybe even years. So that's standard. And what we did was we put basically it's the second sheet of the agreement, and it asks questions. How was this made? Where was it made? How was it delivered? What's your quantity? Etc. And all of those questions go into, again, the calculations that go around figuring out the carbon intensity specifically, but it also helps identify and back up if you do attach or bundle an EAC with the transaction, which can be outlined on the NASB transaction. You can actually back that up with all of the real values that a buyer or seller will need to verify how those carbon intensity numbers came to be, and also what the quality of that EAC is. So Pretty neat stuff. And that optionality helps move transactions much, much faster. It's literally many of the things that are talked about by the traders, if you will, or the transactors at this point that buy and sell the actual commodity. That's what's talked about over the phone and agreed to. So yeah, it was a neat little innovation, and we're going to do exactly the same thing with ammonia.
And I want to get to ammonia, but first I wanted to come back to another point you raised, which is that building a new market requires developing an entire ecosystem. And it sounds like you had a lot of the pieces in place kind of on the buy and sell side, the physical demand and supply side in Houston, probably more development on the demand side than the production side in the beginning. But I just wanted to ask, how has the hydrogen ecosystem been developing along the Gulf Coast? And when you think ahead to like an active trading market in hydrogen, do you now have all the pieces of the puzzle that you need, or do you still need more members of the ecosystem?
Yeah, I think it's a market in progress. Okay. So let's start with defining trading. So it's physical and, of course, financial. Are we ready for a financial market? I don't think so yet. What we need is a broader penetration into the physical market for hydrogen, but also a broader understanding, which is what we're trying to do. We're a nonprofit organization that, basically we are all about having people come in to share information and disseminate information and also help the market mature. With that being said, the market is getting ready to trade. And these contracts that we're talking about, where you're standardizing all of these different aspects of a typical physical transaction, it's the basis for, think about how we went back in the natural gas markets and ended up somewhere, there's something called Henry Hub in Erath, Louisiana, where a bunch of pipes came in off the Gulf of Mexico and now Gulf of America and gathered there. It seemed like a liquid pricing point. Well, we're going to figure out what a liquid pricing point is for hydrogen as well. And what it appears to be right now is a Gulf Coast pricing point because of all of the fantastic stuff going basically from, New Orleans west and basically San Antonio or so east is making up a lot of that. Then also the extremely vibrant Gulf Coast of Texas, which goes down to Brownsville, where they hurrah, hurrah against building another source for demand for hydrogen. That is the first refinery built in 48 years in the United States. And I can remember when the last one was built. And it's high time because basically they've been putting band-aids on very old equipment and obviously upgrading old equipment. But when this is coming into vogue now, and we're in an atmosphere, we may have cut back a little bit on sustainable markets with the administration, but we also have recognized an industrial need on many, many fronts. And this is going to help hydrogen as well and all that demand.
And could you foresee, it also being a global center of trade in hydrogen and ammonia? And how would that work?
Absolutely. So transportation is key, obviously. I can tell you that the demand for hydrogen, both in the EU and Asia, is phenomenal. Especially, particularly, we've been working with the Asian buyers and trying to satisfy what they have to get done. They have been very innovative in technology and using hydrogen. We've been in the industrial side for a long time. They're very much looking at a lot of things having to do with power production, vehicle mobility, and things like that. So we will be talking about soon, and maybe we can even do another podcast to follow up. But there's going to be a lot of neat developments on how hydrogen will be both maybe one produced in these areas, but also get to these areas. And the global market itself is needing to go through some changes on the regulatory side for both of these areas. And I'm very, very encouraged. We have a lot of good friends over in the Netherlands that have been very progressive on working through some of the regulatory issues that have been in place for some time. The Germans have been fantastic to work with other countries as well. That they seem to be the ones that make the headlines, though. Then when you're talking about Asia, we're absolutely right up in front is both the Japanese and the Koreans. Think of mobility. A lot of great cars come from those areas, but also their need for that energy. And they really do need it. And I don't want to leave the one fact out that the largest both producer and user of hydrogen in the world is China. So there's also a very vibrant Chinese market in hydrogen. They produce it and they sell it, and they are selling it onto the marketplace. From strictly not a geopolitical standpoint, but from a market standpoint, it's going to bring down the price. We're seeing more products and they're serving various markets, especially in Europe and things. So it's a big swimming pool. Everybody jump in and let's go at it.
And I wanted to come back to ammonia, which you mentioned earlier, and how that fits into the hydrogen ecosystem. And I imagine it's getting a lot more attention these days with the conflict with Iran and the closure of the straits and what that means for fertilizer availability and just the security of that supply chain around the world.
Yeah. So, one of the biggest, I always, as a broker many years, would always deal with natural gas desks. And on a natural gas desk, some of these bigger companies, especially the big ag companies, they'd always have a fertilizer guy. And I always asked myself, well, that's kind of weird. And then, of course, I went back to my chemistry book and my periodic table and saw that, well, there's hydrogen in there. There's making of natural gas. So, okay, I get it. I get it. So, with that, hydrogen as a base element in so many of these products, whether it's ammonia, which is NH3, or all of the other ones that we use on a daily basis, that base element of hydrogen is one of the things that needs to be in the mainstream market as something that can be moved, bought and sold, and used to accelerate these markets to handle these problems. So when we had our issue there, obviously it's in Qatar with the natural gas facility that had been hit, it put the markets upside down. Keep in mind too, though, who's using those markets over there. And again, the ones that really took it hard were especially Europe and some of the other areas that we've been talking about. So, as terrible as an incident like that is, perhaps sometimes we learn maybe we do need to loosen up the regulation a little bit as to what we can bring in and use in some of these countries. So, at times, a tragic event like that can actually maybe have some eventual good results. So we'll see.
And you mentioned earlier how the Department of Energy was a big push, it created a big push for the initial production of hydrogen hubs and thinking about how to develop this market. The Trump administration has obviously made many changes in its approach to energy and commodities relative to the Biden administration. Just curious, how have the changes at a policy level in Washington been affecting the development of the Gulf Coast hydrogen market?
So let me start by saying, and again, David, you know me well. So I'm a markets guy. I believe let's keep our hands off it and the market will take care of itself in many ways. And one of my mantras has always been no outside influence, whether it be one single company, one single player, one single government, in my mind, can have a long-term effect on a commodity and the way it transacts. So what got me excited about hydrogen is what the government ended up doing by promoting these hubs. It wasn't a grant in these cases. It was something that had to be earned. Okay. And the monies set aside had very, very stringent milestones that had to be met in order to get piecemeal parts of these investments. I still see people today, oh, well, the high velocity hydrogen hub in the Gulf Coast, you guys got a check for 1.2 billion. No, I think interested parties would barely got anything because what the DOE wanted to see was very, very successful additions in infrastructure, job creation. Go down the list of everything that creates, again, an industry that will survive over time. And besides David Crane, of course, the undersecretary at the time that was headlining this, the person that deserves a ton of credit is Leslie Biddle, that was at the DOE. She was really behind the hub idea. Former Goldman Sachs person, former trader, natural gas trader of all things. She understood the market. And like many others that I've run into at the DOE and also things like CFTC and others, the folks that have been in the markets at these organizations really make things happen. And it makes it happen for what's best for the market. So the 45V tax credit and things like that were something that, were being challenged going forward with the Trump administration. But administrations change. And depending how long this particular administration or its eventual maybe some additional years and people that are already in power right now, but it is still an administration that's very market minded. And yes, they pushed for fossil fuels, but I think we can, as an industry and I think as a country, improve our messaging around things like hydrogen. As our president said one time, boy, I wouldn't buy a hydrogen car as those things blow up. Well, there's never been an instance of a hydrogen car blowing up. So it's a matter of changing a little disinformation, getting them comfortable with the fact that if you are, again, I'll say it again, drill, baby, drill, you need to refine, baby, refine. Stopping a market like this is not good. And that's not what's happening. They didn't say stop producing hydrogen. So basically, we were part of the initial look at a lot of balance sheets and things of internal things going on at the government when things were on the chopping block. And again, dare I say, nothing or no one is bigger than the market itself. The market will persevere. It may take a little more time, but I think we're a lot closer than anybody ever thought we were, even 3, 4, 5 years ago.
Well, thanks for joining us, Mike. And before I let you go, I would like to kind of ask you to take a step back, because talking with you over the past few years, it's been really impressive to see how much progress has been made and how far along the road you've traveled with this. But I was hoping you could kind of take a step back and give us your vision for what the Gulf Coast hydrogen market could be in coming years, and then what are the next steps?
Well, and I think this is a great question because I think this comes down to why the Gulf Coast. And again, I would closely equate us with California, believe it or not. But it's the access. So it's industrial access. It's the fact that we're on water. Hydrogen can be shipped. The products that come from hydrogen can be shipped. There are large ammonia carriers right now, et cetera. So the Gulf Coast area, let's just use that specifically, with all of its industrial might, if you will, that's been created over the years, and also its central location within the country. So there's even a program that's been underway for some time to create something called H2LA. So what is that? So very plainly, we see H2 in that for hydrogen, but it also means H for Houston to Los Angeles, LA. And what do we have in common with our friends on the West Coast here in Houston? The I-10 corridor, one of the most heavily traveled commercial trucking, private roads that are traveled every single day in this country. And with that, you have, and I've spoken on panels with these folks, take, for example, for like Love's Truck Stops, Pilot, they went down into CNG roads for many years, now looking at things in many ways on hydrogen. Also, the truck producers are in both the mid-size and large size. All of those things are tying in these industrial areas that will use and produce hydrogen to basically the pathway for the transportation. And then lo and behold, and I grew up near the I-95 corridor in the Northeast, so there's also an endeavor to have the same thing happen on the I-95 corridor. And then, of course, there's the I-69 corridor that goes from Houston and Detroit. All of these major thoroughfares, and that's how it starts. Think of the spaghetti that we have right now in a natural gas pipeline map. I expect the same to happen with transportation and roadways that will one day, this won't happen too soon, but one day have a lot more access to fueling for these types of commodities, whether it be CNG, hydrogen, you name it.
Thanks again to Mike Prokop, Executive Consultant at the Clean Hydrogen Buyers Alliance. We hope you enjoyed the episode. We'll be back next week with another episode of Weathering Decarbonization. We hope you'll join us.
This episode is brought to you in part by Abax Exchange, bringing better price discovery and risk management tools to navigate today's commodities markets through centrally cleared, physically deliverable futures contracts in energy, environmental, battery materials, and precious metals markets. Smarter Markets are here. Contact sales at abax.exchange to get started. That concludes this week's episode of Smarter Markets by Abax. For episode transcripts and additional episode information, including research, editorial, and video content, please visit smartermarkets.media. Please help more people discover the podcast by leaving a review on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform. Smarter Markets is presented for informational and entertainment purposes only. The information presented on Smarter Markets should not be construed as investment advice. Always consult a licensed investment professional before making investment decisions. The views and opinions expressed on Smarter Markets are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the show's hosts or producer. Smarter Markets, its hosts, guests, employees, and producer, Abax Technologies, shall not be held liable for losses resulting from investment decisions based on informational viewpoints presented on Smarter Markets. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week.